The Civil Rights Movement was a pivotal moment in American history. It was a time when African Americans fought for their rights and equality, challenging the status quo of segregation and discrimination. In this video, we will explore the journey of the Civil Rights Movement from segregation to integration. Historical footage of segregation and discrimination, including images of separate water fountains, schools, and restaurants for African Americans. The Civil Rights Movement was a long and difficult struggle that spanned several decades. It was a fight for basic human rights such as the right to vote, the right to an education, and the right to be treated equally under the law. Images of African Americans being denied the right to vote, being attacked by police dogs and water hoses, and being arrested for peaceful protests. The Civil Rights Movement was not just about African Americans fighting for their own rights. It was a movement that inspired people of all races and backgrounds to stand up for justice and equality. Images of people of all races and backgrounds marching together in solidarity for civil rights. In this video, we will explore the key events and figures of the Civil Rights Movement, and how their actions and sacrifices paved the way for a more just and equal society. Images of key figures of the Civil Rights Movement, including Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X. Join us as we journey through the history of the Civil Rights Movement and learn about the challenges and triumphs that shaped a nation. To understand the Civil Rights Movement, we must first understand the system of segregation that existed in the United States for many years. This system was known as Jim Crow. Images of Jim Crow laws, including signs designating separate facilities for African Americans and whites. Jim Crow laws were state and local laws that enforced racial segregation and discrimination against African Americans. These laws were in effect from the late 1800s until the mid-1960s. Images of African Americans being denied access to public facilities such as schools, restaurants, and water fountains. The Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of segregation in the 1896 case of Plessy v. Ferguson. This case established the separate but equal doctrine, which allowed for segregation as long as the separate facilities were deemed equal in quality. Images of the Plessy v. Ferguson decision and its impact on segregation. However, the reality was that separate facilities were often not equal, and African Americans were subjected to inferior facilities and services. Images of dilapidated schools and facilities designated for African Americans. Jim Crow laws also restricted African Americans' right to vote through poll taxes, literacy tests, and other discriminatory measures. Images of African Americans being denied the right to vote and being subjected to discriminatory voting practices. The system of Jim Crow was oppressive and dehumanizing, and it sparked a movement for change. Images of African Americans protesting against segregation and discrimination. In the next segment, we will explore the early efforts to challenge Jim Crow and fight for civil rights. Images of early civil rights activists including W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells. The fight for civil rights began long before the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 60s. In the early 1900s, African American activists began to challenge the system of Jim Crow and fight for their rights. One of the most prominent early civil rights activists was W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was a scholar and writer who fought for equal rights for African Americans through education and political action. Images of W.E.B. Du Bois and his writings. Another early civil rights activist was Ida B. Wells. Wells was a journalist and activist who fought against lynching and other forms of violence against African Americans. Images of Ida B. Wells and her writings. These early activists paved the way for future generations of civil rights leaders. In the 1940s and 50s, a new generation of activists emerged, including Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. Images of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. Rosa Parks was a civil rights activist who became known as the mother of the Civil Rights Movement for her role in the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Images of the Montgomery Bus Boycott and Rosa Parks. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister and civil rights activist who became the face of the Civil Rights Movement. Images of Martin Luther King Jr. and his speeches. King's philosophy of nonviolent resistance became a cornerstone of the Civil Rights Movement, inspiring millions of people to fight for justice and equality. Images of nonviolent protests and civil rights demonstrations. In the next segment, we will explore the pivotal moment that sparked the Civil Rights Movement, the Brown v. Board of Education decision. Images of the Brown v. Board of Education decision and its impact on segregation. The Brown v. Board of Education decision was a landmark moment in the Civil Rights Movement. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. This decision was a major victory for civil rights activists who had been fighting for equal access to education for African American children. Images of African American children attending segregated schools. However, the decision did not immediately lead to desegregation in schools. Many states resisted the ruling and continued to enforce segregation. Images of resistance to the Brown v. Board of Education decision, including protests and violence. In 1955, a pivotal moment occurred in the civil rights movement, the Montgomery Bus boycott. Images of the Montgomery Bus boycott and its impact on segregation. The boycott was sparked by the arrest of Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus to a white passenger. Images of Rosa Parks and the Montgomery Bus boycott. The boycott lasted for over a year and was a massive success, leading to the desegregation of Montgomery's buses. Images of the Montgomery Bus boycott and its impact on desegregation. The Montgomery Bus boycott was a turning point in the civil rights movement, inspiring other nonviolent protests and demonstrations. Images of other nonviolent protests and demonstrations, including sit-ins and freedom rides. In the next segment, we will explore the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, two major pieces of legislation that helped to end segregation and discrimination. Images of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were two of the most important pieces of legislation in American history. These laws helped to end segregation and discrimination and ensure equal rights for all Americans. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It also ended segregation in public places and schools. The images of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its impact on desegregation. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibited discriminatory voting practices, such as literacy tests and poll taxes, and ensured that all Americans had the right to vote. Images of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and its impact on voting rights. These laws were the culmination of years of struggle and sacrifice by civil rights activists, who had fought tirelessly for justice and equality. Images of civil rights activists, including Martin Luther King Jr., and their contributions to the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was a transformative moment in American history, inspiring people of all races and backgrounds to stand up for justice and equality. While there is still work to be done to ensure that all Americans have equal rights and opportunities, the civil rights movement paved the way for a more just and equal society. Images of modern-day civil rights protests and demonstrations. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of the civil rights movement. Images of civil rights activists and the words "the end."